Chapter 38. A Close Shave. It was decided that 2002 would be a year of rest and recuperation for the band. Maiden had been battered, but had come through more intact than ever. As usual, my idea of rest and recuperation was to nibble away at a couple of new projects. Back in the mists of time, I have no clear recollection of who suggested the idea of a metal version of the Three Tenors. The idea was interesting. Managers and, in particular, agents were salivating at the prospect of selling out venues with me, plus two other alleged legends, warbling away. Nice idea, but the devil, as always, was in the detail. I wanted Ronnie Dio from Black Sabbath and Rainbow, and Rob Halford from Judas Priest alongside me, and I think probably everyone else on the planet would have done too. Rod Smallwood was vehemently against Ronnie. I suspect it was because he didn't see eye to eye with Ronnie's manager, Wendy Dio. In any case, Rod suggested Jeff Tate, Queensryche's singer, to complete the triumvirate. I went to LA to try and write an album with Roy Z for the project. Even with Jeff Tate on board, the album was difficult. I wanted any record to use all three voices to their strengths, but also to combine in unexpected ways. It was a tall order in a short time span. The song that Roy and I came up with was called Tyranny of Souls, and it borrowed from the three witches in Macbeth. Each witch corresponds to a voice, and I wrote the melody, the phrasing and lyric to reflect what I considered to be the essence of my fellow tenors. In the demo of the song, I even did a little imitation of their styles to give them a clue as to the intentions of the project. Tyranny of Souls was only one song. I would need several more if I was to make an album of material that did the three of us justice. I had a stage format and presentation that allied with the demo song, but it would take a lot more thought and design to keep an audience entertained for 2 hours. It wasn't simply a question of bolting vocal girders together to form the Sistine Chapel. Pressure from management made me look long and hard at the idea. If there wasn't time to do it right, better not to do it at all, was my attitude. A meeting with Jeff Tate sealed the fate of the project. We didn't see eye to eye about almost everything. I never wanted him in the first place. I always would have picked Ronnie Dio. Tyranny of Souls was thus recycled as the title track on my new and last solo studio album, the rest of which didn't yet exist. I wouldn't be writing it for a while. I'd just been headhunted for a start-up airline, out of the ashes of British World Airlines. In mid-February, I was moving the furniture into Richard Branson's old office building, from where he coordinated his balloon adventures. The desks and chairs were from a skip, including a very nice boardroom table that British Airways had declared substandard. The airline was called Astraeus, and it rose phoenix-like from the ashes of British World Airlines and the remnants of Go, the BA subsidiary. It was the start of the best airline experience ever. Even while Maiden World appeared to be snoozing to the eyes of outsiders, in reality it was always busy. Even when ticking over, Maiden is a huge responsibility to manage, and we'd taken on the challenge of Clive Burr and his struggle with multiple sclerosis. In March 2002, we played the first of a series of benefit shows at Brixton Academy. Clive's chirpy irreverence was still intact, even as he struggled to find any kind of equilibrium with his condition. One day he'd be walking around, the next he would be in a wheelchair. There was no clear pathway for the disease, except that it was ultimately incurable with present levels of technology. Clive was a big Second World War history buff, and we chatted about aircraft and the fact that I was shortly about to start a course to learn to fly a 737. May saw me down at Gatwick, huddled over a computer-based training program that may well have been a pirated copy of Lufthansa software. The clue was in the awful jokes inserted every 40 minutes. So, now you know everything about the 737 air conditioning system, so you are a cool guy. The hoops to jump through were the same as with British Airways, so after ground school, simulator and base training, I entered the on-the-job training, which was abbreviated on account of my experience as a first officer on a 757. I had quite an interesting experience on my first day at work. It was Gatwick to Faro, a full flight with 148 passengers on a very old and beaten-up 737-300. After British World went bust, Australis had inherited their two rather long-in-the-tooth 737-300s. It was a glorious day, and from 150 miles out, Faro gave us a radar vector for a 12-mile visual final. Basically, the sky was ours. I descended, turned right towards the runway, and started to slow down. I could see the threshold. Visual, disconnecting autopilot. The aural alarm of the autopilot being disconnected was silenced by a second push of the button. My eyes were firmly out of the window, judging the final approach visually. Flaps 1, I commanded, the captain's hand positioned the flap lever to 1. Speed 190. The training captain rotated the speed knob to read 190. I reduced thrust. Flaps 5, speed 180. I glanced down at the airspeed. She wasn't slowing down very much. Shit. Gear down, flaps 15, speed 150. The racket of the gear dropping into the airflow sounded comforting, but we were 1,200 feet above the ground and still not slowing down. I'll give you a hand, the training captain said, and he reached for the speed brake and pulled it all the way out. The speed brake is 2 barn doors on each wing that raise into the slipstream, destroying lift and increasing drag. We slowed down a bit, but not nearly enough. At 800 feet, the aircraft shuddered and the control wheel juddered violently as the stick shaker activated. We were on the point of stalling, and Mr. Boeing wants you to know, so he installed a system to rattle your nerves should you approach a stall. This is the stick shaker system, which does exactly that. I glanced down. The flap lever was at 15, but the flap gauge told a different story. No flaps had deployed. No wonder we hadn't slowed down. I was looking out the window. The training captain was probably monitoring my flying, but the fact remained that we were on the point of stalling at 800 feet with 148 passengers. Going around, I declared, but this was a rather different situation. I reverted under stress to the 757 and I firewalled the throttles. Shit, don't do that, the engines will melt, said the training captain. The 737 had no automatic protections like the 757. In any case, I started a very shallow left turn out towards the ocean as the speed increased. With the airspeed at a more sensible 210 knots, we entered the hold offshore at 2,000 feet. We would have only 20 minutes to sort this out before fuel became critical. As it happened, all the efforts to get any flaps or slats to deploy were useless. After 10 minutes, the only option was a landing with no flaps and no slats at Faro. I think you'd better do this one, I said to the captain, before checking the performance tables to see if we'd stop or go off the end of the runway. We were within 2 or 3 miles per hour of the maximum tyre speed as we touched down at over 200 miles an hour. To Boeing's eternal credit, the 737 stopped with 150 feet to spare, and we disgorged our passengers. We never found out how the problem arose. The local Portuguese engineers wanted to take the wing apart there and then. We decided to phone home ET style and call our own engineers. Their advice was blunt. Switch the aircraft off, wait 15 minutes, then switch it back on again. So we did, and it worked. The Portuguese engineers went away, grumpy. That summer I flew all over the place. Funchal, Innsbruck, Sharm el-Sheikh, plus all the usual holiday spots, Greek islands, Alicante, Malaga and Palma de Mallorca. I had such a torrid time on the 737 ground school course that I offered to write a study guide for new pilots. Having written it, I was then co-opted into the training department and packed off to Amsterdam to run ground school courses and debrief exams. I was supposed to be a wild and crazy drug-fueled rock star, but here I was in a simulator teaching company standard operating procedures. Go figure. I really enjoyed it. I remembered how hard I'd found it on occasions when I first started training, and I was determined to encourage others not to give up when the going got tough, as it inevitably did at some point. I was still fencing, but not with any degree of expectation of the success I'd had 10 years before. I was 43 years old, and still in pretty good shape, but I was starting to pick up injuries, and they lasted longer. The foil is a mobile weapon, heavy on the legs. I was lucky that my legs were well maintained by hurtling around on stage with Maiden. In the heat of competition, though, the springs became a bit creaky just that little bit sooner than the opposition's, to my intense annoyance and their benefit. I flew 300 hours in the 737 during the summer and autumn of 2002. By now, Astraeus had added a pair of new generation 737 aircraft to the fleet, and in the space of a year, we had 4 aircraft. Some of those aircraft were old, and equipment failures often meant that pilots had to actually hand-fly them. One day, I turned up for work, where Gatwick to Athens and back was the mission, except the plane was broken and all its autopilots were not working. I expected to be back in my bed at home watching late-night TV around 1 a.m. In fact, that was the time I eventually took off. We hand-flew the aircraft to Athens and back overnight, finally landing at 9 a.m. I was so tired I could hardly see the white lines on the road driving home. I pulled over and slept for 3 hours. Character-building stuff. By contrast, going on tour with Iron Maiden was like going on holiday. The looming Give Me Ed Till I'm Dead tour was a great escape to warm up the vocal pipes before the official Dance of Death album tour, which would spill into 2004. The album, of course, was already in the can. We had recorded in the urban Bohemia that was Notting Hill in West London. The studios, now called Psalm West, had quite a history. Jimi Hendrix had lived in an apartment upstairs, and a huge sunken bath was installed at the request of Bob Marley, who clearly enjoyed a good soak with his smoke. The whole album, for me, was not quite as good as Brave New World. It was as if we had a little creative hangover and were just trying that little bit too hard to top the previous effort. The one exception, in my opinion, was Adrian's solo composition, Passchendaele. It was jaw-dropping lyrically, musically and emotionally. It gave us a set piece to recreate on stage. I set about doing that with barbed wire, dummy bodies and portable searchlights to rake the audience. The cover was also controversial. A partially finished version was presented as a work in progress, but Steve loved it and was not to be shifted. Personally, I still find it embarrassing. We had such a tradition of extraordinary and iconic covers, I couldn't help feeling that maybe the artist should have had a little more say, seeing as the visual was his essential medium. The artist was so mortified that he withdrew his name from the album credits. I didn't blame him. I was flying the pants off the 737 for Astraeus, right up to the Give Me Ed Till I'm Dead tour. Looking back now at the schedule, it was gruelling and the pressure was on, because we were now headlining arenas at a minimum, with outdoor shows accounting for almost a quarter of the total gigs. The idea was to set up the Dance of Death album with what was essentially a greatest hits tour. The Gimme Ed Till I'm Dead tour was the not-so-subtle double entendre that lasted for over 50 shows and 3 months across 2 continents. Give Me Ed rolled straight into the Dance of Death tour. I resumed flying the 737 and put in another 100 hours in between the 40 European shows. All the heavy iron flying was well and good, but I yearned for something more interesting and romantic. I bought a share in a German biplane, a Booker Jungmann. Dating back to before the Second World War, the Jungmann was a primary trainer for the Luftwaffe. It was open cockpit, fabric and wood, and operated from grass runways. Better still, it spun beautifully, and in the right hands, not mine, it was a graceful aerobatic aircraft. Not only that, but I swear that it improved my jet landings. It was a reconnection with the elements. Dance of Death blitzed the world again in January 2004, Latin and North America, then Japan. We played the Universal Amphitheatre in Los Angeles for 2 nights. The crowd was surprisingly boisterous for such a plush venue, and I went flying, but not in the way I normally intended. Trips, slips and falls are part of the risks associated with leaping around stages, juggling microphones and guitars. Over the years I've fallen over in front of thousands of people and usually got back up relatively unscathed. Yannick wasn't so lucky at a show in Mannheim, Germany. He fell headfirst into a steel girder, tumbling several feet to the ground. I was horrified. I thought he was dead. His body lay at the foot of the stage, his limbs arranged unnaturally by his loss of consciousness, his head covered in blood. He was not moving, and I couldn't see if he was even breathing. It happened in a heartbeat. One slip and he was gone. It took Yannick several weeks, months in fact, to recover fully. My demise was equally sudden and was indirectly attributable to Yannick's birthday celebrations. In the early days, birthdays were things to be celebrated, especially when we were not so old as to be candidates for radiocarbon dating or counting tree rings. Celebrations normally ended up with paper plates of shaving foam being splattered over the hapless band member. Latterly, we'd learnt that shaving foam tasted pretty disgusting and stung like hell, so we relented and used whipped cream instead. A couple of the excess whipped cream pie plates were placed on top of the catwalks at the rear of the stage, just adjacent to the front corner of Nico's drum riser. The wood that comprised the floor of the catwalk was painted matte black. The cream soaked into the wooden boards and remained invisible, but it was slippery like an oil slick. I was in the habit of running up to the edge and making great drama of my emergency stop. Except, on this occasion, I didn't stop. My head went from 12 feet above the stage to impact in a fraction of a second. It happened so fast that the band didn't notice. So fast I was disappointed to discover that my plummet wasn't even captured on video. Where was a handy bootlegger when you needed one? Like most accidents, things go in slow motion until impact. After that, it hurts. As I tried to slide to a stop, I went headfirst towards the drum kit. Make a plan, I thought. Protect ribs at all cost. Tuck and roll. But I had a bass drum and a set of aluminium steps to fall over before I actually struck the stage itself. I stretched out my left arm, which was not holding the microphone. I would try to bounce off the bass drum, then forward roll onto the stage. I had figured without the cymbal stands, and the gap between my little finger and ring finger caught on the spigot sticking out from a crash cymbal. It wrenched my left arm behind me, ripping my chest muscles and twisting my back, so I went backwards into the kit. I was still holding the mic after I rolled and stood up. I carried on, but the pain was intense. The next night was the same, and then we all flew to Japan. I was a pathetic mess. At the first show in Japan, my back gave way, and I spent the next 4 weeks hobbling around the first week of it with the aid of a stick. I was supposed to return to LA to finish the vocals on the Tyranny of Souls album. Roy had sent me various backing tracks, and I wrote the lyrics while limping round the streets wearing headphones. I duly arrived in LA and set up a bed by the side of the microphone in Roy's home studio. I could manage about 5 minutes of singing before I had to have a lie down. I was not a happy bunny, but remarkably, the album sounded amazing. It was released with little in the way of fanfare, but it has garnered a steady following over the years. Chapter 39. The Spruce Bruce. My aviating had led to an approach from a TV company who wanted to make a show for the Discovery Channel. The title was Flying Heavy Metal. I'd made some music videos and was still busy juggling the script of Chemical Wedding, but TV documentaries were uncharted territory. Like everything else, it was a learning curve, and a steep but enjoyable one. The initial idea was quite unstructured and mainly based on the idea of me wandering around and flying planes. I'm not a fan of celebrity-based shows. I wanted a proper structure and a story. The style of presentation could allude to the celebrity angle, but the content had to be rock solid underneath. Ricochet, the production company, wanted 3 months to film 5 half-hour episodes. I told them I could do it in a third of that time, including 2 weeks in the USA. As a result, the schedule was pretty tight, with long shooting days, but the results were fantastic. There was always a degree of tension over the script, which was dumbed down and which I frequently ignored, rewriting it on the hoof. Most of the best bits of the interviews I did never made it into the series, otherwise we would have been making 10 one-hour shows, and then we really would have been filming for 3 months. Typical was the session where I flew the prototype Airbus A320. Because it was full of experimental equipment, I could legally fly it with a test pilot on board. Consequently, I could do things that most Airbus pilots have only done in a simulator. Tail sliding over the Pyrenees, engines at idle being just one of them. The Airbus has all kinds of protections built into its normal flight controls to prevent mishandling, and one is that the flight control system will not permit a bank angle in excess of 60 degrees. The director had the camera pointed at me from the back. The GoPro cameras were capturing my face. He was wedged out of sight, lying on the flight deck floor behind my seat. "Can you say 60 degrees and the Airbus says, 'Roll no more'?" he shouted as I rolled the aircraft on its side. "OK," I replied and said the line. Oh, just again, the sun was a bit weird on your face." The test pilot leaned over and whispered gently in my ear, "Don't hold it at 60 for too long, old boy. The laws of physics still apply." Later, in the USA, I was due to fly the Boeing 727. The aircraft was an empty freighter. The director of the film was very clear. "Now listen, you're not insured to take off and land." "Oh, OK." The captain jumped in the seat, and there was a flight engineer on board, which was a first. We started the engines and taxied into position on the runway, deserted in the middle of the Everglades. "You're a 757 guy, huh?" the captain asked. Yep. Hell of a plane. Used to fly them myself." He thought for a moment and then said, "Standard Boeing calls and procedures. You have control." To my surprise, a hairy hand grasped the 3 thrust levers and pushed them forward to set takeoff thrust. It was the flight engineer, and it was his job. The plane started to move. My hands were on the control column, feet on the rudder pedals. "What are you doing?" squealed the director. "Taking off." You're not insured," he panted. "No, but I am," grinned the captain as I pulled back on the controls and the sublime Boeing creation elegantly streaked into the warm Florida air. Early 2005 saw the show air, and it was a great success, achieving surprisingly good ratings amongst female viewers, to the delight of the network. I did one more show for TV, although I was offered most of the series if I wanted. Sky were producing a series of shows entitled Inside, followed by the subject matter. One was Inside Wayne Rooney, for example. The producer had commissioned Flying Heavy Metal and had moved on from the Discovery Channel. We had lunch and discussed my involvement, all of which made me feel terribly grown up. "I don't really have the time. I know how long these things take. Look, what's the most potty one you have?" I asked. "Inside Spontaneous Human Combustion." "Brilliant. Completely bonkers. Can I do just that one?" Documentaries are fun because they turn knowledge into entertainment. But I've turned down over 20 series since. I simply don't have the time. Chapter 40. What could possibly go wrong? Summer of 2005 was a US tour followed by a brief festival tour of Europe. It was about 7 weeks long in total, and afterwards the writing urge was stronger than ever. Steve and I were starting to converge, and I began to get the same sort of goosebumps I'd had before the Seventh Son album. If we just took our time on this occasion and didn't do everything in an unholy rush, the next album felt good. We allowed ourselves plenty of time and therefore used hardly any of it. In fact, it was difficult to keep up with the number of ideas coming thick and fast. The album was on the verge of becoming a double, but we held ourselves in check, lest we bit off a bit more than the audience could swallow. It was clear that there was a theme running through the album. I had reprised a song from Skunkworks, Strange Death in Paradise, and repurposed the idea for Maiden with Brighter Than a Thousand Suns. The song was about the atom bomb, and of course, we were all children of the Cold War. The themes of war and conflict were plentiful on the record. I suggested the title, A Matter of Life and Death, after the classic Powell and Pressburger epic, which is one of my all-time favourite films. The title had the advantage of being not exclusively about war. It is, in fact, a love story where love redeems all. It therefore could cover a multitude of song topics without being specific to any of them. It was, in a word, enigmatic. The cover was anything but. Skeletal zombie mercenaries riding shotgun on a militarised, Eddie-stenciled main battle tank. We met with Rod. We want a tank on stage and a fucking big gun. This was boys' own adventure stuff. Nuance went out the window. This was the apocalypse, end of story. We recorded in Psalm in Notting Hill again and took no prisoners. Large chunks of the album are first takes. When we listened back to it, we decided to play the whole thing live. In many ways, that decision set in stone a process we had started with Brave New World. The world of media had become so shallow, so short-term, that it had effectively disowned us. There was, therefore, no point in pandering to ancient history either, unless, of course, you wanted to write a song about Alexander the Great, which, of course, we had. To the outside world, it looked like madness to play a whole album of new material. To us, though, it was essential in order to lay down a marker with what was an increasingly young fan base. There were kids whose first Iron Maiden record was Brave New World, not The Number of the Beast. They were the future, and they were the people to carry the torch for the band. It was for them that we played that album. It was a gamble, but we rolled the dice anyway. Mainstream media and Maiden had always been unreliable bedfellows, and now we effectively kicked them into the long grass. Anything in the future would be on our terms, as the internet was becoming increasingly useful, a trend that has, by and large, continued. The airline was now at 9 aircraft and would shortly grow to 11, with 5 757s, 5 737s and an Airbus A320. Even as a small airline, we had over 500 employees, and there was always a need for captains. We had a lot of over 55 ex-British Airways guys, but the supply had dried up, and soon pilots would no longer retire at 55 but work, like everyone else, till 65. Most pilots wanted to anyway. Unlike the big behemoth airlines with hundreds of crew and Byzantine seniority rules, we were small and operated on a pragmatic promotion system based on demand and merit. As an experienced first officer, I'd been assessed as suitable for command training, the first of several hoops to jump through before becoming a captain. The bulk of my training came after our short A Matter of the Beast tour, and a good job too, because becoming a commander requires your full attention. I flew to Hurghada in Egypt, Uralsk in Kazakhstan, Mykonos and various other points in between. The time rapidly approached for my check flight. All boxes ticked and all quizzes answered, I turned up to fly to the tricky little airfield of Calvi in Corsica. What could possibly go wrong? Well, initially, nothing. It was a sunny day and the winds were light. Calvi is a one-way in, one-way out airfield, on account of the bloody great mountain at the end of the runway. It's a captain's only landing, so I flew it on the basis that I would end up as a captain, or not, at the end of the day. The landing was fine. We disgorged the passengers and I started on the flight paperwork. Then I noticed 2 official-looking chaps staring at me from outside the cockpit window. I wound it open. "Ramp check," one shouted. A ramp check is a sort of mini-inspection by the authorities, in this case the French DGAC, to ensure safe operational standards. I welcomed them aboard, made them a cup of coffee, and they started pulling apart our documentation, flight plans, navigational logs, all standard stuff, and of course, there were no problems. "I just need to see your licence médicale." So I showed them, all in order. "And the other pilot, where is he?" Well, the other pilot, my Czech pilot, had visited the toilets at the rear. I paid a visit. He cracked open the toilet door. "They want to see your licence," I said. "I haven't got it," he hissed. "What? It's in my other jacket, in Red Hill." "Oh, can't somebody get hold of it?" "No, I'm the only person with keys." "Shit." I went back to the cockpit. I made another coffee for them. Maybe I could persuade them to go away. "Ah," I said, "we are just starting to board. Is there anything else you would like to see?" "Oh, no," they replied, "just the other pilot with his licence." Ah, I owned up to the problem. They laughed. "Oh, this is not the first time this has happened. Simply fax us a copy and you can be on your way." Before electronic records, our operations department kept copies of licence details in a filing cabinet. I phoned Gatwick. "Oh, sorry," they said. "We don't have keys to the cabinet, and it's a bank holiday weekend. The only person who has keys is away." This was turning into a farce. "Look, you'll have to break into the cabinet. I don't care how you do it." My Czech pilot finally appeared, suitably apologetic, but there was no moving the officials. We sat and waited. The aircraft was fueled up and ready. I could sense the problems already arising with the passengers. I would have to say something over the PA. The phone rang. It was operations. "OK, the fire brigade are coming." "What?" "Yes, they have a big axe and they're going to chop the cabinet open." The image of Crawley Fire Brigade wreaking destruction in our small ops room to obtain a photocopy raised an internal chuckle. An hour later, the document arrived and we finally took off for Gatwick. As we approached 41,000 feet, the left-hand engine overheat light came on. We nursed it back to Gatwick at reduced power till it seemed to operate normally at lower altitudes. Back at Gatwick, check passed, I pondered the day's experience. What could possibly go wrong? Anything. And if it can, it will. Chapter 41. Bruce Eyre. It was the 10th of July, 2007. I was a Boeing 757 captain. I could never have believed it possible when I sat in that tiny Cessna 152 in Kissimmee back in 1992. How the world turns. The world was turning in the film department as well. Finally, we had a trickle of funding and we had found our star in classical actor Simon Callow, who had wanted to play Crowley for years. A special effects company contributed a sort of benefit in kind, but no cash, and we ended up with a budget of £500,000 to make the feature. Along the way, I had to make a presentation to a bunch of high-net-worth individuals about the movie in the hope of raising cash. It was a thoroughly depressing experience. There was a banker with a convoluted tax scheme, pie charts, graphs, and the phrase, "Even if it tanks, you make money." Great. That really set the scene for my presentation on what the film was all about and what artistic effect they could achieve for their money. For the most part, they fiddled with their phones or laptops, then left. Feeling grumpy, I spied one enthusiastic soul still drinking coffee and, shock horror, actually smiling. "Hi, are you going to put some money into the film?" I said. "Oh, no, certainly not," he smiled back. "Well, if it's not a rude question, why are you still here? The coffee is lousy." You see, I have a project I need to raise money for, and I heard about this tax scheme, so I thought I would tag along and try and copy it." This was the most interesting man I'd met all day. "What's your project?" I asked. "Oh, I'm Roger Monk, and I build airships." I'd seen this man before. He was a visionary who had recreated the modern airship before advocating in a Discovery Channel documentary a revolutionary hybrid vehicle combining hovercraft, airship and aeroplane that would travel point to point with large payloads for a fraction of the fuel cost and inconvenience of using airports, then trucks or railways. I was enthused. "Come up and see me sometime," he said. He gave me his card. The address was the hangar at Cardington where the R101 airship had been built. I had the plastic kit when I lived in Worksop. Nothing in childhood is ever wasted. I would go to see him, but not yet. First, I had my other crazy plan to attend to, a round-the-world tour in a 757 with the band, crew and equipment on board. The legendary Ed Force One was in preparation. The basic idea for the whole scenario had already been rehearsed on the Skunkworks tour, but the justification of a tour costing millions required more than just the basis that this might be fun. Although, frankly, in the spirit of rock and roll, what more justification is needed? Fundamentally, the case for Ed Force One depended on two strands coming together. First, we as a band had a requirement to tour all the odd and out-of-the-way places in the world. On the internet, we were being hounded by thousands of fans who were demanding to see us. Second, we needed a big, cheap aeroplane. Ed Force One worked out because of the vagaries of the aviation industry. Rock's peak touring time in the biggest Southern Hemisphere markets is late summer. In other words, February and March. This is exactly the Northern Hemisphere winter period during which a European airline such as Australis would chew its arm off to have an aircraft on a 2-month contract. There was a cheap deal to be done. A perfect storm came together, an airline that needed to do a deal, a band that needed access to markets to satisfy its fans, and an income versus expenditure that meant the price was right. After crunching the numbers, it made unexpected business sense. We only intended to go round the world once, but ended up doing it 3 times in rapid succession. Such was the success of the concept. Like most things, the devil was in the detail. The 757 had to be extensively modified, and the rear of it, where passengers normally sat, was turned into a cargo compartment. The airline had to negotiate various hurdles before the final form and shape of the structure was agreed. A bulkhead was installed between passengers and cargo. In fact, it was the old flight deck door, obsolete since 9/11. In the cargo compartment, a steel floor reinforcement was installed, plus a cargo liner around the roof and sidewalls, which involved removing the rear toilets and galley. To meet European regulations, smoke detectors monitored whether the drum kit might spontaneously combust, and, even if it did, cameras were fitted to the flight deck so we could observe the event. Last, but by no means least, giant cuboid bags were constructed, which were designed to be fireproof, and these engulfed the equipment strapped to the reinforced steel floor plates. The fire testing of the bags was farcical. Petrol bombs were hurled inside them, and they were promptly extinguished due to lack of oxygen. After several more attempts to provoke disaster, the authorities gave up and issued a safety certificate. After 2 hours of trying to set fire to the bags, the surface of them was barely warm to the touch. We did have one exceptional problem, however. There was a severe lack of storage space on the aircraft for food and water. The enormous rear galley had been removed and was off-limits during flight. Nevertheless, the storage space was available, so we asked the Civil Aviation Authority the question, can we use the rear galley space for stores? No. Why not? Fire hazard. What about storing water? No. Why not? Fire hazard. There are some things that are just not worth arguing about. The backstory to Ed Force One actually began in Paris. When I was flying the 737, I came up with the idea of flying a bunch of Maiden fans to a show and back. Predictably, I called the concept Bruce Air. I chartered the aircraft myself and put together a team to administer tickets, a rather splendid goodie bag unique to the experience, and a chaperone to supervise ground transportation and overnight hotels if required. There were trips to Paris, Milan, Prague and Trondheim, to name but a few. The Paris trip stands out, if only for having the most number of sick bags I have ever had to deal with on an aircraft. When we took off from Le Bourget, there was no realisation of just how serious the weather would be at Gatwick. A freak line of thunderstorms was moving swiftly toward the airport. The turbulence was excessive, and it was barely possible to read the flight instruments. The normal headwind at Gatwick had sheared to a 50-knot tailwind. A poor Flybe turboprop was on final approach when the controller told him the bad news. The pilot didn't seem so happy, but then again, our passengers weren't delirious with joy either. The aircraft was battered at the storm's edge. I was weaving in and out of nasty red lumps showing on the radar screen. A squall line of extremely violent storms had suddenly appeared from the southwest, and, as we transited it, the cabin was tossed around like a log flume in an amusement park. The punters were not amused. Gatwick was shut, and everything was grounded. Wind shear is a very hazardous weather phenomenon that can bring down airliners. It's a sudden and often powerful change of wind direction, so much so that the wings of an aircraft lose lift. A lone British Airways aircraft took off underneath us. He radioed to the tower. "For your information, at 1,000 feet, we had 0 rate of climb with full power." Normally, the rate of climb would be 2,000 to 3,000 feet per minute with reduced power, so this indicated an extremely hazardous situation. We waited another 20 minutes for the storm to pass and then landed. An array of passengers slumped off the plane, faces either white or green, having accounted for at least 25 very full sick bags. Bruce Air, as a mini charter excursion project, continued for a while until I broached the subject of Ed Force One with Rod. To my amazement, he thought it was a very exciting idea. It tied in so many different strands. It was win-win, both for the airline and Iron Maiden, and it was not just a way for me to keep flying, it was something that genuinely seemed to seize the imagination of the whole world. On Ed Force One, we carried 3 pilots at all times, which included me. This was not just for crew rest, but insurance against sickness. And for good measure, all of our pilots were captains. The very first stop was India, and we refueled on the way to Mumbai at Baku in Azerbaijan. The only crisis thus far was running out of beer. Mumbai was charming, and we stayed in an excellent hotel. So far, so good. From Mumbai, we were to fly to Perth, with a refuel stop just west of Singapore. I was being rested. I'd just done a show, so I checked in with everyone else. In a t-shirt and shorts, sitting in row 1. I declined the glass of white wine in favour of coffee, white, 1 sugar. Alan Hale, the captain for the day, was his usual chirpy self. I stuck my head in on the flight deck for 5 minutes, then left them to it. 2 hours into the flight, I got a tap on the shoulder from our senior cabin crew member. "Could you pop in the cockpit?" It was not an anti-aircraft missile or an engine failure that might cause us to land prematurely. Captain Hale was looking anything but hearty. He was slowly turning grey. We went through his breakfast menu. He'd been sunk by the Mumbai sausage. I stayed around. At first he protested. No, I'm fine." I waited. "Actually, I'm not fine," and he jumped out of his seat and retired to the toilet and then to the back of the aircraft, and I didn't see him again for 3 days. This is why we have 3 pilots, I thought, as I strapped in. It was a long night. We refuelled at Bandar Aceh, and I had never seen so many ships in all my life as we flew over Singapore on the way in. Refuelling was protracted as we argued about who would pay the bill. It was supposed to be prepaid until someone found the facts under a pile of papers in a chaotic-looking office. We landed in Perth just as the sun was rising on a glorious day. The Aussies had never seen a 757 before and had no tow bar for it, so we parked up in the middle of nowhere. Unloading was unique to this machine, as was loading it. We had to explain the routine to the ground handlers and emphasise the need to be careful not to wreck the main doors at the rear. Every piece of equipment had to fit through those doors, and a ham-fisted handler could easily damage the seals or door slides, which would have grounded the aircraft. The sun was well up in the heavens by the time the plane was empty. The other captain and I had been abandoned. The transport had gone, and everyone was asleep. Great. Luckily, the local customs officer was a cheery soul. "Hey guys," he said, "I'll get them to open up the VIP suite for you. At least we can shut the plane up." Ah, Aussie hospitality at its best, or so I thought. The VIP suite had some comfy sofas and a well-stocked bar. Frankly, we both deserved a beer. Thank you, Mr. Victoria Bitter. As we sat back, dog-tired, and savoured our beer, what sounded like a character created by Barry Humphries boomed down the corridor. "No spirits, only beer, and no bloody musicians." A very hostile-looking host of the VIP suite appeared at the door, eyes squinting at us. He peered closely at me. Trainers, shorts, but I was wearing a high-vis jacket. You're not a bloody musician, are ya?" "Me? Heavens, no. Both pilots." "Yeah, well, I bloody don't like 'em. I had that bloody sting in here once, some eco-bollocks to do with the Prime Minister. Anyway, no bloody spirits. Welcome back to Australia." We didn't so much romp around Australia as tour its extensive toilet facilities. The pernicious Indian bug laid low almost everyone in various stages of incapacitation. Steve has always had a sensitive tummy and suffered more than most of us, but the dressing room on occasion looked like a dysentery triage outpost. The schedule was punishing on these tours. It had to be in order to justify the costs, but the results were outstanding. In essence, we were doing gigs with the same regularity as in Europe, except that instead of London to Antwerp overnight, we were doing Tokyo to Los Angeles. Jet lag was extreme, and it troubled Adrian in particular. Because we were going the wrong way round the world, we lost time continually. I planned it that way for two reasons. Firstly, we needed to be awake at 9 p.m. local time every night with our bodies ready to jump around and perform. Going the right way round the world means that by 9 p.m. your body is saying, "It's 2 in the morning, go to sleep." The disadvantage of my plan was that opportunities for sightseeing and a social life were curtailed. It was impossible to go to bed until dawn, and hence you didn't wake up until 4 p.m. My attitude was that we were there to work and to perform at our peak. If we had to find a pub at 4 a.m. to socialise, then so be it. We were also, of course, flying with the prevailing winds behind us, which saved quite a bit of aircraft time and fuel. Air Force One was probably the most photographed plane in the world in 2008. Everywhere we went, there were TV helicopters live on the national news, and if the US President himself had arrived, I don't think the reaction could have been greater. As we landed back in Stansted, the plans for the continuation of the tour in 2009 were already underway. Chapter 42. Alchemy. The Chemical Wedding movie reared its head again. I met with the sales agents. They were a thoroughly disreputable bunch when it came to representing what the film was about. They were attempting to piggyback everything on Iron Maiden, which was, of course, a non-starter. More than that, what really got my goat of Mendes in a lather was their treatment of Lucy Cudden, our female lead. Lucy's a talented actress who worked extremely hard in the movie. The Hollywood salesman proudly showed me the poster they were using to pitch the movie. It showed a photoshopped Game of Thrones-style buxom warrior with a great mane of ringlets. "Who's that?" She's not in the movie.
No.
Well, why is she on this poster instead of the lead actress?
The tits, the breasts are just so much more prominent and, well, that's the stuff that sells.
While I struggled to avoid thumping this twerp, the movie was actually in the process of setting up. Bushey, north of London, was the location, and the crew set to in earnest. The movie opened on the day of Aleister Crowley's death, and the mortified Mr. Crowley was played with admirable menace by John Shrapnel, a gravel-voiced stage actor. Everything was cut to the bone. Exterior shots were expensive and kept to a minimum. Most of the shoot was done at a disused Masonic school, which already doubled for various locations in several TV series. I recognised it because we'd shot a video there for Abduction from Tyranny of Souls. When we availed ourselves of the autopsy set one evening, Julian Doyle directed that too. I had 2 or 3 cameo moments in the film. In fact, most of the crew ended up in it at one stage or another. I played the dodgy landlord of Mr. Crowley's flat, complete with comedy bad back. I discover him dead from an overdose of heroin. My only 2 words in the movie. He's dead. Take 5. Enter the room, kneel by the body, feel the pulse, check for breathing, at which point the corpse made a remarkable recovery.
Fucking hell, get on with it or I really will be dead.
Apart from me, the shoot was quick. Simon Callow was extraordinary. His preparation was word perfect, and every take was usable. When I hear about the professionalism of actors, Simon is a benchmark. Once wrapped, we had to screen it and market it. Why don't we do the Cannes Film Festival? Every objection was made, including the lack of hotel rooms, hideously expensive flights, and, of course, the fact that we weren't invited. All true. So far, so good. So what? Let's just rent a cinema in Cannes, fly down in the Iron Maiden plane with a bunch of journalists and cameras, and pretend that we have been invited. Which is exactly what happened. A day trip to Cannes, watch a movie, do a load of press, have our interviews on the promenade like movie stars, then fly home to bed. No hotels, no permission, and it all worked out cheaper than flying commercial. Flying commercial was what I returned to in between the Ed Force One tours, interspersed with radio shows. I flew trips to Lourdes from Dublin, scheduled flights to Tel Aviv from Heathrow, and, just to be even-handed, went to live in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, in order to service the annual Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. To spice up the mix further, Astraeus also became the national carrier of Ghana, so I flew the 757 on its daily trip to the capital, Accra. Ghana is a terrific place, friendly, good food, but like many African countries, there are always small caveats. The government was not terribly disposed to paying on time. In response, the Iron Maiden aircraft was dispatched to Accra. No one would get on it. Eddie on the tail terrified the locals, who thought the aircraft had bad juju. To make matters worse, passengers also refused to board the Virgin plane next door on the grounds that the juju might be contagious. The money turned up more rapidly, and we agreed to provide a more modestly decorated aeroplane in future. The same problem was not true at RAF Brize Norton, where we had a 757 based permanently to transport troops. I made several trips to Akrotiri, Al Minhad and Thumrate. One in particular was memorable. We flew out to pick up the RAF regiment from Cyprus. They had been decompressing for some days after a harrowing deployment in Afghanistan, where they'd lost several personnel on the tour of duty. The Padre insisted on visiting the cockpit and giving us all RAF service Bibles. I thumbed through it. It was exactly the same as the small volume carried by my godfather in the Second World War. The passengers were, as always with the military, outstanding. Quiet and unassuming, but always ready to take the piss at the drop of a hat. They were being returned to a world that could not possibly comprehend what they'd been through. Our destination was unusual. It was not Brize Norton, but the small runway at RAF Wittering near Peterborough. In the middle of a grass field by the runway, there was a ski jump developed for the Royal Navy. "Home of the Harrier," said the caption on the side of the wooden structure. Lining the side of the runway were all the kids and wives and partners of the personnel on board. Probably the loved ones of those we did not bring back too. Children held up homemade banners, reading, "Daddy, you are always my hero." I could hardly taxi the aircraft. Julie, my co-pilot, was looking the other way, out of the side window. Her eyes were welling up with tears, and so were mine. She was trying to hide it, but I had to avoid hitting anything, and I could barely see through the tears flooding my eyes and flowing down my cheeks. I applied the brakes, composed myself, and wiped the liquid away. "Clear left, clear on the right?" I asked. Julie looked over at me and nodded. We said nothing, but we both knew how each other felt. Chapter 43. Bitter Experience. A new year, 2010, was beckoning, and a new album, and beyond that, a mammoth greatest hits tour designated Made in England, which would keep the band on the road until 2014. Compass Point Studios in the Bahamas had been booked for early 2010 to record, and we wrote and rehearsed in a studio in Paris. Some of the material was ready to go, some was written in rehearsals. Coming Home was specifically written about the headspace that pilots inhabit in their strange internal world. It was an attempt to touch the outside world with what is normally only an internal moment of reflection. The Final Frontier was both a delicious wind-up, as in our last album, and a reference for Trekkies everywhere. Space was the theme for the cover, and the idea of comic book cover-style single artwork was my idea, but executed far better than I could have imagined. I was never 100% convinced about the space monster Eddie, but we did do a spectacular animated video. By and large, we were now avoiding being in videos if we could possibly manage it. The best thing about space monster Eddie was his evil eyes, and they were very scary indeed. El Dorado was an attack on the banks and wheeler dealers who had brought down the world economy, along with a sideswipe at the rest of us for being so naive as to believe their bullshit. We finally got a Grammy for that track, having been nominated in previous years. Recording in the Bahamas was a little strange. It was not the place it had been in 1983. Most of the charm had been replaced by American concrete. In my hotel, I could have been in Florida, Vegas, or anywhere else in the USA for that matter. My favourite hangout was a daiquiri shack by the side of the road. I suspect that the sideline of the owners may have been related to the acrid weed smoke coming from the car park, along with the comings and goings of enterprising young ladies. The daiquiris, though, were spectacular, and there was a splendid Bahamian soul food stall next door. During recording of the album, the awful earthquake hit in Haiti, and I ended up entertaining a crew from Australis in the daiquiri shack, which was unexpected. The Icelandic owner of the company had decreed that Iceland Express, his own brand, must send aid to Haiti, and thus a 737 full of supplies had been dispatched. I rented a scooter and rode to and from Compass Point every day. The studio was run down, and it was obvious that it was nearing the end of its life. The couple who ran it knew it too, and ours was the last album they made, quite literally, the final frontier. We had to bring in large amounts of equipment to record, and we ended up barely using any of the existing studio kit. The jack plug patch bay on the desk, for example, was so badly corroded that it was barely usable. It was a sad but symbolic way of consigning the 80s to ancient history. The album was mixed in Malibu in producer Kevin Shirley's upstairs mixing suite, and that's where I did most of my vocals. It simply wasn't worth wasting time doing them in the Bahamas. As 2010 turned into 2011, it was the return of the 757, complete with the Final Frontier paint job. It was our longest and, we thought, our last gasp of a round-the-world aircraft tour. Jakarta, Seoul and Belém in Brazil were new destinations, humid and toasty. Our opening show in Moscow was the polar opposite. and we nearly didn't make it at all. The previous day, I'd flown the aircraft out of maintenance at Southend and into Stansted to be loaded up. On the way, we did an air-to-air photo shoot over the North Sea. The camera ship was a Jet Provost vintage military trainer, and it had severe difficulty keeping station with the airliner, even with us at minimum speed and our flaps deployed. The next day, the aircraft developed a problem with its bleed air valve in one engine. Predictably, like loose wires in fire detection systems and other gremlins, problems always arose when leaving maintenance. We only had a short time to fix the problem. We delayed the flight by over 4 hours. We even had a new piece of piping manufactured on site, but it didn't fix the problem. Ian Day, our tour manager, told me that if there was no change, we would have to charter 2 aircraft, the cost of which would be borne by the airline. It was £500,000. No pressure then, as the captain in charge, representing both Maiden and the airline. One good reason for not being issued with a uniform hat is that there's no provision for wearing 2 at the same time. After we dragged the aircraft out for the 4th engine test run, I called in the engineer. Take a long, hard look at that gauge. Well, I think I see an improvement. Sign the fucking tech log then and let's go before the aeroplane changes its mind. Moscow was a blizzard, with thick ice on the runways. We flew from the winter fury and 2-foot-long icicles into the tropical heat of Singapore with a sense of relief. We thought we'd have a fuel stop and a short break in Bali, and as we were going there, we arranged a gig. The venue was surrounded by cliffs, including a small one backstage. I decided to climb it 20 minutes before the show. I was about 15 feet up the vertical face when the rock started to crumble. Silly boy. The rock was porous and liable to turn to dust beneath your fingers. I had 2 choices: fall off and try to cling to the wall, or just fall off away from the wall. 15 feet doesn't sound a lot, but believe me, falling down a cheese grater in a t-shirt and shorts is not an option. I pushed off the wall and, to my great surprise, hit the ground immediately. I was sure I'd broken my foot. I hobbled through the gig, and later, in Melbourne, I had my foot x-rayed. It appeared to be okay. To this day, my right foot aches after shows. Oh well, do the crime, do the time. The final frontier was reached back in Stansted on the 19th of April 2011. We'd been gone nearly 11 weeks. Jet lag was insufficient to stop the Maiden juggernaut recommencing a tour by truck and bus, starting the 28th of May and finishing up at the final frontier shows at the O2 in London on the 5th and 6th of August, the day before my 53rd birthday. It was a 35-date 4th leg of the tour, and frankly, I think we were all feeling a little fried at the end of it. Unlike the Power Slave tour, we acknowledged it to ourselves, and I had a particularly robust evening with Rod Smallwood. There was no question, I said, of anyone walking away, but if we did not manage our bodies as we got older, our bodies might just do the walking on our behalf. Not only that, but we were having, and should be having, the time of our lives on tour. I had no intention of retiring unless I had to. I made the suggestion that little and often was a better strategy than trying to reconquer the world every year. We would last longer and be more effective, and the world wouldn't get fed up of us being in its face every 5 minutes. There was, of course, another greatest hits tour planned, and we had almost an entire year to recover. I went back to flying, but not for much longer. The airline that I was employed by, and which had borne Iron Maiden around the world on its silver wings, was about to go bust. The writing had been on the wall for some time. Astraeus had been losing money since day one. The Icelandic owner had insisted on using our aircraft at bargain basement rates. Good for his Icelandic travel company, bad for our profitability. To make matters worse, 2/3 of our fleet was sent to Iceland for the summer, except the Icelandic summer only lasts 4 months. The rest of our competitors were putting their fleets out on 6-month contracts at market rates. The winters were always a problem. Only 2 aircraft were needed in Iceland. The other 9 cost $500,000 a month each to park up unused. It was a death sentence for over 500 employees at Astraeus, and the end of one of the best experiences of my life in working almost 10 years with the company. There were plenty of other things to occupy my attention in 2012. The last of our 3 greatest hits tours was commencing shortly, and it was one of my favourite eras, covering the Seventh Son album in all its epic glory. We emerged into the Floridian sunlight to rehearse for our Made in England tour, 100 dates starting with some of the biggest US and Canada shows we'd done in ages. Even on tour, aviation kept popping up in unexpected places. A visit to Boeing in Seattle meant meeting my namesake, Bruce Dickinson, the manager of the 747 and 767 projects. I flew the 787 simulator, and the instructor watched me fly a few landings before he asked, "Would you like to see what she'll do?" At 8 miles out, with the autopilot engaged, full flaps and gear down, plus a 46-knot crosswind, we failed an engine. I sat back and watched as the autopilot adjusted and performed a perfect landing, stopping itself in the middle of the runway. He was right. It was impressive. The chief test pilot for the 747 was seated in the back, impassively. "We'll go fly the 747-800 next," he stated. "Bear in mind, for this aeroplane, the pilot needs to show up," he added dryly. Little did I know that a few years later, this experience would stand me in very good stead. The US tour was a spectacular success. Our days of tour buses were long gone. We were chartering planes to take us around and even starting to adopt American practices such as basing ourselves in one place and commuting to shows. It made sense, and it made days off usable. In America, it was so easy to accomplish. I chilled out as a passenger and discovered the joys of backseat driving. We had several months' break between the end of the USA leg of the tour and the beginning of the European one. Tours were increasingly becoming summer affairs, as there would inevitably be an element of outdoor festivities involved at some point. None of us objected. We'd done plenty of winter tours in the USA and Europe, and summer, late spring and early autumn seemed infinitely preferable to the snow and ice. Winter was for hibernation, or making albums. Even though Ed Force One was history, history itself had us in its gunsights. I couldn't believe it when Rod phoned me to tell me he'd arranged for a Spitfire to open the show at Donington, as in a real Spitfire from the Battle of Britain memorial flight. The idea was that it would fly over the top of the stage moments before we started our own intro tape for Aces High. We had a helicopter on hand to film it. Our camera guy wasn't quite au fait with the language of air displays, so I did a bit of mediation. I spoke to the Spitfire pilot beforehand. "What height are you cleared to?" I asked. 200 feet. "And what do you propose to do?" "Well, come in low over the back of the stage, make one pass around the crowd, and then exit back over the top of the stage." I was visualising it, and a large internal grin started to develop. "I suppose," I began, "that there is always a possibility that through optical illusion, the aircraft may seem to be much lower than that." "Oh yes, that's quite common." I'm saying nothing further, save that the roadies hit the deck on the final pass. It was a heart-stopping moment, and Donington's collective jaw dropped. Grown men fought back tears. It was a Griffon-engined Spitfire, which has a distinctive growl as opposed to the whistling howl of the supercharger on a Merlin engine. No one will ever forget that moment. It upstaged everything. The Made in England tour, Part 2, lasted the summer of 2013, and at the end, we returned to the USA for a brief spell. After that came Latin America and the beginning of the last leg of the Made in England tour. The pace of work and projects intensified as, like red London buses, you wait all day for one to come along, then 10 turn up at once. For a year or so, I'd been farmed out to do corporate speeches. At first, I was deeply suspicious. My initial gig was to 200 travel agents at a conference in Malta. I had absolutely no idea what to do, and I rambled back and forth for 45 minutes and then shuffled off into a corner. There were a few more bookings until one day, in Sweden, the light bulb moment happened and IBM's global conference gave me a standing ovation. Like music, speaking is a combination of content and performance. It's not a lecture, it's not telling jokes. Actually, it's another theatre of the mind, just without guitars and without Eddie. The whole speaking circuit scene was a complete unknown to me, but it is a huge worldwide industry. I suppose that, as the world turns politically correct shades of beige, there will always be a demand for oddballs who scream for a living and fly airliners. The one thing I don't do, however, is talk to people after they've had their dinner. It's rude to give them indigestion. Pilots, of course, are quite social creatures, and I met the head of training for Air Atlanta Icelandic, Arna, a 747 operator, who was curious about the screaming airline pilot. Having a coffee, I popped the question. "Your 747s, how many do you have?" "Oh, I think about 15 of them." "You wouldn't happen to have a spare?" Arna thought for a minute. "I believe we do." "You don't fancy an Iron Maiden world tour, do you?" The next red bus to come along had writing on the side of it. There was a proposal to develop a Maiden beer. The two big ale drinkers in the band were Nico and me, but Nico lived in Florida. The harsh reality was that some hapless fool would have to drink sensibly and creatively to come up with what would become a beer called Trooper. It was a thankless task, but someone had to do it. The world of brewing comes with its own pitfalls, and it turns out that some breweries seek the same high standards that we do. Before we could do anything, the brewer wanted to make sure I was serious. I thought my auditioning days were over until my taste buds were placed in the firing line when I met the prospective brewers, Robinsons of Stockport. I was put through a blind taste test of 10 different brews, some of which I had name-checked as personal favourites, and the rest of which were their choices. To my surprise, I identified half a dozen of the beers. Without wasting any more time, Martin Weeks, their master brewer, set about my nose with hop teas and my mouth with crunchy malt grains, and by the end of the afternoon, we'd come to a bare-bones sketch of what our new liquid would be. One thing we agreed on was that the bottle experience should try to be as close to a cask experience as was possible. This meant a beer heavy on flavour, yet low on carbonation and acidity. It was to be an everyman beer, something you could live with and return to over time like an old friend. There are plenty of extreme beers in the marketplace, most of them short-lived. Robinsons and I wanted to create a classic, and I believe we did. Martin made 2 test brews, and the great day came up at the brewery. 2 half-pint glasses, versions A and B, direct from the tank. It was the second version by a country mile that got the nod of approval. Trooper was born. As I write this, 18 million pints of the stuff have been drunk worldwide. We were looking forward to the next album. To my delight, we were going back to Guillaume Tell's studios in Paris, the scene of the brave new world order. The summer tour of 2014 would set the band up in the right frame of mind for the new record. In 1914, people said the war would all be over by Christmas. By 1917, aviation, born with the Wright brothers, had been advanced exponentially by the demands of warfare. At first as reconnaissance aircraft, and then as bombers and fighters, the modern Air Force was created. Of all the legendary pilots in the war, none was more infamous than the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. Most of his victories were not scored in the red-painted Fokker DR-1 that he was killed in, probably by a bullet from the ground. His death, though, did cement the legend in aviation folklore of the fearsome Fokker triplane. At the end of 2013, I bought one.